So I'm going to just take a quick poll here before I get into things. Who here came to this session because of the provocative title of the session? Raise your hands. Who here came to the session because there's nothing else interesting? And who here came because they have actually used Drupal or had a deployment problem with Drupal? Okay. So 2.5 years ago, I started working at TVO. I was hired as the development manager and architect for web development. And I was enticed away from this successful career for consulting into this organization because an offer that I couldn't understand. But I wanted to prove myself. I had this good, successful consulting career, but I still wanted to prove myself, and I wanted to make my mark in those first 90 days. So some weeks into that period of time, I came across that the development team was going to be deploying a new release. And the system administrator for that deployment team, a character, comes complaining and saying, "Oi, this organization has Alzheimer's. They can't remember from week to week how deployments work. The business unit, I'm having to explain to them for the 15th time how deployment is going to happen." Well, I'm new, I have patience, and I start asking this guy some questions. Oh yes, and it was a guy, of course. And I ask these questions, and what I discover is an excessive amount of time that is spent on preparing stuff for release, an excessive length of time for code freeze, an excessive amount of personal work effort for testing the releases before they get into production and as they're getting into production. And this is what I mean by living a nightmare. There was so much time being spent on releases that there was no time to really do any significant new development. We'd do a week of development and a week on a release. It was just a nightmare. Well, but that led me to dreaming this dream. Does that work? Yes, that works. But no presentation is complete without just a little bit of background about the organization where this is happening. TVO was established in 1970 by the Minister of Education for the province of Ontario, Canada. It had this mandate written in 1970, 10 years before IBM introduced the IBM PC. Use electronic and media to provide educational opportunities for all people in Ontario. Well, as a broadcaster, that was great. But then in the last 7 or 8 years, TVO has embraced the disruptive technologies of the internet. And we provide content, the linear video content from the broadcast on the website, but also content specific to the mobile and internet space. We are funded primarily by the Ontario government and supplemented with donations. We have 3 big products. One of these is a high school that is high school courses provided online, and it's diploma granting. We have a site that is devoted to kids school age and preschool with educational games and activities. These are all involved or developed with the involvement of teachers who then relate the content and these games back to the Ontario curriculum. And then we have our main flagship website, which is, contains the current affairs and documentaries for TVO. Well, so let me get back to my story about our deployment. This deployment situation, we would have a code freeze about 4 days in advance of when we're actually going to deploy code to production. And then we'd have these 3 different passes of manual regression testing. The system administrator would go and take the staging environment and refresh it with data from the production environment. Let's ignore the suitability of that and accept that it was okay in this situation. But what happens as soon as he refreshes the environment? The business units were asked to verify, is this refreshed environment now representative of production? They'd spend a half an hour or whatever doing some regression tests to say, oh yeah, you refreshed the environment correctly. We're now ready to proceed with the next step. Okay, communication would happen back to the sysadmin. Now the new code that is being released with the new functionality is put onto that staging environment. And then the baton would be handed back to the business units to say, is the new functionality working in this staging environment? And they'd spend some time checking the new functionality that was accurately working in the staging environment. And they would also do some regression tests that the new functionality didn't break the staging environment. Okay, we get past that hurdle. Then we'd come to the actual deployment to production. We'd take the site down offline at midnight, put Drupal into this maintenance mode, and do the process of updating or deploying the updates into the production environment. And those same people who had done the tests before would go and verify the new functionality was working in production and do some regression tests verifying that nothing had broken in production. 3 times doing the same set of tests. It was no wonder they really didn't understand what they were doing. They were just being asked, go here, test this, repeat. Go here, test this, repeat. Go here, test this, and repeat. It made no sense to them. So I don't blame them. I saw that situation as an opportunity. This wasn't going to be my win in 90 days. This was a longer-term opportunity. And all I had to do was 3 easy things. I had to get the developers to change a little bit about how they were writing some of their Drupal code. I had to introduce some automated tests. And I had to introduce some automation into that release process, that it wasn't someone at a command line typing, copy these files, put this version from our version control system onto production. Easier said than done. But let me dig into each of these a little bit. Let's talk about the automated tests for a moment. I thought that I could introduce the automated tests first. In and of itself, I thought the automated tests would provide some value even if I didn't accomplish any of the other things, because those repetitions, those 3 times of repeating the same tests, maybe I could reduce those. So I started by bringing in a book into the office and having some conversations with some of the developers. And there was one developer in the group who kind of got interested. They had never heard of any of this idea of automated tests, but one developer started to get interested. That was great. But a few months later, we only had a small number of tests. So that wasn't enough. It wasn't a suite of tests that we could depend on. Fortunately, there was some other changes going on in TVO and in this department. We had a new manager coming in who was going to be reporting to me. And we also had some new positions allocated to the department. And this new manager made a suggestion, said, why don't we take a couple of these new developer positions and say, these are going to be devoted to automated tests. We're going to go and recruit for and find people who love writing automated tests. Well, that proved to be really good, because some months later, we now have a suite of tests that's quite comprehensive and that we feel we can depend on. So, awesome.
How many months?
Probably about, well, it depends on the length of, or the length of the development too. But in this case, about 4 months. But that's also aligned up with the development. So let me dig into the coding practices. there were two things going on here with coding practices in Drupal that had to happen. First, we had to stop this idea of point and click when you're going to deploy something. Everything had to be in code. And, well, there was a little bit of resistance to that, but that was managed to be overcome with just a little bit of discussion and understanding. And, people started to realize what was going to be the benefit of that. The slightly more difficult change in how Drupal was going to be coded was the fact that Drupal provides two capabilities for our site. It provides both the system that is creating the HTML that's going to be served out to the browsers, but it also has these back-end systems that the content producers, people who are writing the pages and writing the articles, the full editorial and creation process is also part of Drupal. Well, during deployment, we couldn't have the database changing while we're actually deploying because we might need to roll back. And if it's changed while we're deploying, they would lose their changes. And so we explored a number of different alternatives for how we were going to solve that. And the solution we landed on was to turn Drupal to a read-only mode. And it turned out that that actually is relatively easy to do. But that meant something else. It meant that if we were going to deploy in the middle of the day instead of at midnight, that we had to be really fast in our deployment because we can't stop the rest of the machine that is TVO creating content and articles. Which brings us to automation in that deployment process. Now, our system administrators were used to this idea of the load balancers being a mechanism for reliability and availability and scalability. They didn't change them dynamically. They were always hand configured. Well, one of the things that we changed, that we're introducing in the automation, is saying we're going to have automatically through script, have the load balancer stop using half of the web servers. We're going to update that half of web servers, do our automated tests, make sure that the update is now working. And when we're happy with that, we're going to automatically bring the load balancers to be pointing to our new servers and serve all content from there. And then update the rest of the servers and let everything be back in the mix. Is that pretty simple, straightforward? This is not rocket science, right? OK. Well, the system administrator, the one who talked about Alzheimer's, was not the type of person who was into writing scripts. No amount of persuasion and inspiration was going to change that. Our solution ended up being to hire some temporary help. Which brings me to some of the key points in this presentation. What were some of the organizational culture issues that we had to overcome? Well, this whole concept of the turning off the load balancers and having Drupal in read-only mode, this meant there was conversations that needed to happen between the developers and the system administrators to have that organized. Well, that was just something that was not inherent in the culture at TVO at the time. We also have the challenge that some of the project managers needed to be reminded, and they have the challenge of remembering to include infrastructure work in the backlog. So a few collaboration things going on there. I've already alluded to a little bit about automation being a bit of a challenge. That having to introduce automation into this system administrator work needed some injection of new thinking from outside. And then there was some organizational change going on at the time. But in many ways, that actually proved to be a benefit rather than a disadvantage, because some of those organizational changes brought around this idea of developers dedicated to automated tests. Now, throughout this things that were going on, we were trying to develop this new capability, but the existing website still had to work. So one of the things that I needed to do in order to create some capacity and some resources of availability for making these changes is I had to get executive support to stop the flow of new requests for the existing website. I had to work with a number of the other directors to figure out what was the priorities of their requests. So there was some challenges there in bringing that alignment, communicating all of that. That takes time, and it takes time then for that to have an impact on that request flow. Now, while I was preparing this presentation, I came across this interesting insight about what was going on in this situation. Why was I able to actually do some of the things that I've done? And it comes down to the fact that my title, that Einar mentioned, Director and Architect of Web and Mobile Delivery, means I actually have two hats. In one hat as director, I have responsibilities for managing and coaching development staff. This includes setting priorities and establishing policies of how we work with other departments. And then on the other hat, as the architect, I have responsibilities for the technology roadmap, the system development lifecycle, the pipeline of work processes, and some other technical concerns. Now, what does that mean? When I was wearing that architect hat, I was able to make those decisions and had the authority to make the decision saying, we must introduce automated tests. I had the authority to make a decision saying, we are going to automate our system administration. And authority to say to the developers, no more point and click, everything in code. But then that had an impact on saying, what is the job descriptions of a number of people? As the director, I actually had the authority to change that. I had the authority to identify that some developer positions were mostly about writing automated tests. In many organizations, and as I've been hearing at the conference here, in many organizations, that is very much a split set of responsibilities. And if you are the architect, you are probably having to go find the managers and directors that you have to influence and persuade and inspire to have changes in the workflow and have changes in the job duties and responsibilities. Yeah, raise your hand if you're in that situation. Yeah. So let's take a moment now to reflect on how is this experience related to architecture thinking. If I break down this definition, and this definition is from an old paper from Mary Shaw from 1994. And I'm going to focus in on the line in there that talks about the assignment of functionality to design elements. Now, I am considering that those load balancers and web servers are part of my design elements. Before, the functionality for those load balancers was about reliability and failure. If one fails, then your site is still available. What I've now introduced is I've assigned to those load balancers a role in maintainability. And now for those, this is where the answer to Einar's question. which ility is this about? I consider that this whole experience is about modifiability or maintainability of the product. If I look at the concept here about global control structures, saying to the developers that saying to the organization, we are going to put the back end into a read-only mode, is changing a global control structure. So that's where the architectural thinking comes into play in these experiences. My overall goals in this challenging nightmare and vision of a dream was to reduce the length of that code freeze from 4 days down to maybe 4 hours if we could. Not sure yet how long it is, but it's definitely being reduced from 4 days. Reduce the effort put into any of these releases, particularly that manual effort in regression testing. Reduce the management overhead into this work, and a few other desirable side effects of things. And I did that through these 3 big changes, introducing automated tests and having the read-only mode so that we could do this automation of the release process. And you're probably all wondering, all right, Gail, what is the current status of all this? Well, on March 20th, we had our first beta situation. So we had everything installed on production servers. And since March 20th, every week we have been running a release of whatever is at the top of our version control stack, whatever is at the top of our branch. We run the scripts, and they automatically deploy that new content and that new functionality to these production servers. We are not yet in production. We have not yet flipped the switch from current functionality, current website, to this new setup. But I expect that in about 10 to 12 weeks. So it's getting much closer. I never anticipated, and I would never have predicted, this linkage between an architecture decision into recruiting decisions. It's quite surprising. And out of this whole situation, there's a number of observations that I've made that are true for my situation. They might not necessarily be truths for yours. But they had to do with the collaboration between the system administrators and the developers. So that DevOps working together to come up with an overall plan was very important. That motivating different people in different ways, I've only touched on that, but that motivation factor was important. And the organizational changes that eased that was very valuable. You'll notice that throughout this, I talked very little about Drupal. Didn't say anything about which tools we use to automate, that technology choice at that level didn't matter at all. We could have been using Chef, Puppet, Vagrant, Docker, Bamboo. It wasn't going to matter. What mattered was the process. When we started this some years ago, we were living a nightmare. And in about 10 to 12 weeks from now, we should be living the dream. So, thank you. Is there any questions?
Questions, Dennis? Gail, you know that time marches on. You're going to need more changes and more innovations. Do you think that your staff is in a better position today to be able to take on the next architectural change or process change?
So thank you for asking that. So did everyone hear the question? Okay. Is the staff in a better situation now to take on more architectural change? they are, I'm glad you asked the question in that way, because yes, they are in a better situation. Are they in as good a situation as I would like? Well, maybe not, but they are in a better situation.
Okay.
Some other questions?
Did you also stop any means to monitor your applications to enforce, fault tolerance, all that stuff, along with automation?
Okay, so let me see if I've understood your question. You're wondering if we had introduced in this some monitoring for failure of the various components.
Uptime, number of failures, log monitoring, incident management.
Okay, so we have two ways that we're monitoring the overall infrastructure. We're monitoring the server, some aspects of the server. We're using something called Zabbix. It's keeping a monitor on whether the server is just up and responding to pings, how much file, disk space usage, and CPU load is there. But we're also using some monitoring of the web pages and the website itself. There's a bit further that I would like to go, but because I'd like to actually have some of those automated tests, not the whole suite, but some of those automated tests incorporated into some monitoring to know that certain key pages are still working and behaving properly. Is that where you?
Yeah.
Okay. Some other?
Okay, last question.
Right. I guess I'm trying to understand your automated test. Are you doing sort of like test-driven development more, or is this more automating and creating a QA department per se, or quality assurance tests?
What we've done has been, so the question, in case you hadn't heard, was, is the automated test approach more about a test-driven development first, or just automating and having a QA work automated? And I would love if they were doing TDD, but they are not. They are writing automated tests after the fact. But that's a step first. We're taking baby steps, and that could be a step further and get us closer to being able to take on more architectural change.
Okay.
So thank you, everyone, for your time.